Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very, very happy to address you all one more time, and this time again, I propose the relevance of defense economics. Um, as you may have deciphered, this is an area where I have worked on for at least 30 years in terms of scholastic content. The exercise started way back in 1990 when I was a graduate student in the United States, and the immediate cause at that point in time was perhaps the first televised war of the planet. I'm talking of the Gulf War, the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, and I was bewildered, like many, to note that multiple markets reacted adversely, leading to humongous losses to speculators, retail investors, institutional investors, sovereign funds across the board. Losses were recorded, major fluctuations were felt, sensitivity in terms of doing business was hit, in the sense that people started becoming insensitive towards doing business and started moving their money to safer instruments in the bond markets. The fundamental issue was one of insecurity, and shortly after the war, in an extremely well-researched report by the Arab Monetary Fund, they pegged the actual cost at 620 billion US dollars. This amount was the actual expenditure in terms of the amount Saudi Arabia paid to the United States, and allies, the amount Kuwait paid to the United States, the building of airfields, equipment, so on and so forth. Just to put things in perspective, in early 1993, the World Bank and its affiliates defrayed a sum of money far less than $620 billion in the sub-Saharan African region. Primarily, the money was meant for bolstering the food verticals. And by early 1997, the food ecosystem in sub-Saharan Africa had become something which was the envy of the rest of Africa, and there was development for all to see. So when I did an analysis in 2016, the amount of money, $620 billion, could have actually ensured all-round development vis-a-vis 4 verticals in sub-Saharan Africa in that 4-year period, and the verticals were that of health, education, infrastructure, and the food verticals. All-round development would have ensured as a result of that. The bottom line being that wars cost a lot of money, and if for nothing else, only for this reason, we all need to ensure that there is enough peace and harmony in this world. Anyways, my interest in defense economics was kindled no end. So much so, in the fall of 1990, I decided to research the defense economics of 2 of the largest democracies in the world, that of the United States and India. In effect, I have collected and done some seminal research in this matter, meticulously documented the defense budgets in India, the defense expenditure in the United States, so on and so forth, that in 2016 I did a rigorous analysis leading to the writing of an anthology which contains 36 articles. I started that in 2017 and finished it in September of 2018. And pretty much this narration is what is contained in the anthology. This narration is about the defense economics of India per se, and I would be covering a 70-year period, 1947 to 2017. So let's begin with 1947. The narrative essentially would be in three parts. The first part would be the economic underpinnings of India for the 70-year period, followed by defense economics per se, and finally the albatrosses and solutions. So in circa 1947, when India attained her independence, the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, inherited an economic mess. Fundamentally, the British had looted us for 150 years, hardly invested anything back, and to add insult to injury, we had to pay what was at that time a whopping amount to Pakistan as well. The net result was that there were many restraints for the Prime Minister, and given the fact that in the first half of the last century, 1900 to 1950, there were a number of areas in India which suffered from drought, which had famine even, the Great Bengal famine of 1930s. There was civil unrest in many places, and therefore there were a number of constraints as well. The British hadn't invested in the warehousing system, so the constraints were humongous. It was in this milieu that the Prime Minister of India, the first Prime Minister of India, had to take a call vis-a-vis the economic model under which India will operate. Let me spend a minute or two here ideating on what I believe was Pandit Nehru's thought process in this matter. And let me say something here. I said Pandit Nehru's thought process because at the time of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister's office was run by the Prime Minister himself. There was no office per se. It only started with Lal Bahadur Shastri. The PMO came into being with Lal Bahadur Shastri, and to that extent, Pandit Ji was an outlier. He took his own decisions. There has been a lot of talk about Pandit Nehru adopting Fabian socialism on the basis of the advice of Harold Losky, a professor at the London School of Economics. Whilst it could be partially true in the sense that he did hear him out, he also heard out people like V.K. Ramaswamy and a few other Indian economists. But fundamentally, when he realized that there were huge problems and that we required a perspicacious model to deliver on welfareism per se, he settled for Fabian socialism. Hindsight 2020, I think it was the best thing for India at that point in time. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru did what was in India's highest and best interests. A lot of economists and politicians have criticized him, and in fact many of them much after his death. In my most respectful opinion and submission, I think the criticisms are far-fetched. So let's get into why Pandit Nehru did this and what is Fabian socialism. As I just said, Pandit Nehru realized that given the humongous restraints and constraints, we required a model which would work for India. He went with the model of Fabian socialism, which was characterized by four major significant issues. One, centralized planning, large number of PSUs, high levels of taxation, and high levels of regulation. Now, this model of Fabian socialism literally lasted from 1947 to 1991. In 1991, the brilliance of Narasimha Rao brought liberalization, which went on till 2014. And 2014, Prime Minister Modi has endeavored to usher laissez-faire economics. Nonetheless, on these major four, all these models will be discussed under the rubric of these four major coordinates I've discussed and how things shaped up. First thing he did was to have centralized planning. So Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru realized that in a country which is so vast, with so many different religions, so many different ways of doing things, we do require to have a planning commission in place. He gave it so much importance. He himself became the chairman, and after a search, a well-meaning search, he identified Sir V.T. Krishnamachari, I beg your pardon, Sir V.T. Krishnamachari as the vice chairman of the planning commission, and Sir V.T. Krishnamachari was chosen because he had previously been the Prime Minister of the princely states of Baroda and Jaipur and a member of the Constituent Assembly, and there were at least 3 reports done by international bodies about the economy of India in the princely states, and they found that the Baroda model of economic governance was by far the best. In fact, in 1944, the citizens of Baroda had even honored Sir V.T. Krishnamachari. So he was chosen to be the vice chairman of the planning commission. And the first 3 plans, 15 years, were all dovetailed towards effectuating on welfareism, agriculture, agro-based industries, rural infrastructure, rural warehousing, and then ports, and then in the 3rd plan, post and telegraphs, as telecom was called then. Excuse me. Fundamentally, it was all to provide for food, clothing, and basic shelter. So, and the overriding objective of Pandit Nehru was on eventuating on welfareism per se. Now, after the sad passing away of Pandit Nehru and a brief period of Lal Bahadur Shastri, Mrs. Gandhi continued with the genre of welfareism, and she actually took 2-3 steps which made it look like India was getting towards a communist state in terms of a lot of control measures, which I will talk about when it comes to deregulation. Nonetheless, she held on to the planning commission. The planning commission, in fact, had a major objective during her time, and that was eradication of poverty, Garib Hataao. And after she passed away, a sad assassination, Rajiv Gandhi continued with Fabian socialism, but he was the first to realize that India needs to industrialize even in the private sector. In fact, my analysis and research of India's economy states that the baby steps of liberalization were taken under the stewardship of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. In fact, the 1985 Dream Budget, which I will talk in a few minutes, was all dovetailed towards creating industry in the private sector, encouraging collaborations and so on and so forth. And after what I consider to be one of the saddest days I've had in India, in May of 1991, when I heard the very, very sad assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, India was ruled by, just before he passed away, India was ruled by a curious Golem-Froy of people and parties who continued with Fabian socialism, some of whom claimed to draw the blueprint of liberalization, but in actuality it was started by Rajiv Gandhi. But after the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, due to the situational dictates provided by a weak economy and a crisis looming in terms of foreign exchange, the brilliance of Narasimha Rao emerged, and even in his time, the Planning Commission ideated on providing for freer markets and at the same time ensuring that the PSUs grow. This was brilliantly taken forward by the genius of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and he had in his plan an infrastructure emphasis. Now I say the genius of Vajpayee because politics and economics cannot be separated, and normally what happens the world over, not necessarily India, is that when a government is elected to power, the first thing they do is to try to reverse some of the previous government's policies. Vajpayee realized that Narasimha Rao had delivered very well on the economic front. He endorsed it and took it forward. That's why I called him a genius. UPA won, largely bankrolled by the successes of Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee. Of course, Dr. Manmohan Singh brought in sustainable development, which was continued in UPA 2, but UPA 2 by and large was a major disaster due to the 2008 crisis and then the Euro crisis and the scam tainted governance in India. And 2014 saw the rise of Narendra Bhai, and he ensured that he did away with the Planning Commission and brought in the National Institute for the Transformation of India, hindsight 2020, a well thought of measure, so that the Planning Commission increasingly becomes an advisor more than anything else. And the emphasis actually moved from liberalization to laissez-faire, in effect from aggregate demand to aggregate supply. This I will talk later in a while from now. The second major coordinate is that of PSUs. Now, let me say something here about the legendary J.M. Keynes. There is hardly anyone in the world of economics who has made a contribution which has lasted for generations like John Maynard Keynes. Keynes believed that aggregate demand is bolstered when the governments of the day intervene, and in a wartime, by spending on defense, employment is generated and aggregate demand is effectuated. This was a simple paradigm which worked very well and brought America out of its Great Depression as well, and the world thereafter under the F.D. Roosevelt regime. Now, every Indian economist worth his salt, from the legendary V.K. Ramaswamy to me and the future, will all be groomed in the ideation of J.M. Keynes simply because our professors were groomed in his ideation. Even the economists of India who study in the US don't let go of J.M. Keynes. They could get into monetarist and supply side economics, but still the fundamental basis on which they operate is to understand how Keynes would have operated in a particular situation. And India then was no different, V.K. Ramaswamy being a professed Keynesian. PSUs were ushered in. Pandit Nehru realized that creating employment via PSUs would provide for a certain amount of predictability and a high level of employment. All the defense PSUs, HAL and the ordnance factories were incubated by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, continued by Mrs. Gandhi, bolstered by Rajiv Gandhi, and so much for the criticism of Jain. Narasimha Rao, when he liberalized, understood that by partial disinvestment we can unlock a lot of value. Now, had Jain not created those PSUs, you wouldn't have had anything to unlock here. Brilliance of Vajpayee, he took it forward. Manmohan Singh realized this, that we require a very strong PSU system, of course, with professionally run boards, and therefore this investment. And of course in Modi 1.0 there was nothing adverse, but till 2017 at least he didn't disinvest 100% in any PSU, and though of course it is beyond my remit because I completed the anthology in 2017, my simple analysis of the situation is that India cannot go in for full disinvestment in PSUs. It will be counterintuitive, but that is a different point. It is nothing to do with the anthology today because it is till 2017. And the third quotient, which is all about high levels of taxation, Jain realized that we require revenues, the high levels of taxation, and it was continued by Mrs. Gandhi, in fact taken even more to a higher level, and then Rajiv Gandhi in a dream budget of 85 realized industrialization requires lowering of taxes. That's why I said the baby steps of liberalization were taken by Rajiv Gandhi, and this was built on brilliantly by Narasimha Rao, Vajpayee, even Manmohan Singh, the tapering of taxes, and till 2017 Modi continued in the same genre. And now the fourth quotient, which is regulation. India was completely regulated under Jain. I mean, everything was under license Raj, everything had a quota, everything needed some kind of permission from the government, and this continued with Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Rajiv Gandhi realized that perhaps too much of control is wrong, and again the first steps were brought in. He allowed for collaborations, he allowed for a certain amount of transfer of technology and so on and so forth. Then of course situational dictates were such that Narasimha Rao went for liberalization, and liberalization simply meant that regulations became less and less, and it continued, throughout the periods of Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh. UPA 2 was too much of liberalization, and it led to a lot of scams as well. And when Prime Minister Modi took the decision of taking India to laissez-faire economics, in effect what he was doing was getting India to supply-side economics. India, under Keynes, had an emphasis on aggregate demand. We moved the entire spectrum to aggregate supply, and the simple analysis would reveal that under the regime of J.M. Keynes and under the ideation of J.M. Keynes and the rubric of Fabian socialism, you have the factors of production either controlled by the government totally or controlled partially by the government, and the government will have a say in it. Now the factors of production increasingly will get into private hands. Now whether this is entirely right is something future generations will debate on, but my own take on the situation till 2017 is that India needs to go in for a mixed system, wherein we do require to have, the government does need to control the factors of production to a certain extent, emblematized by controlling PSUs up to 51%. The balance can be in private hands because India has its unique set of problems. So the growth rate under Jain was little less than 3, and after Rajiv Gandhi, towards the end of Rajiv Gandhi's period, it started climbing up 4.5, 6 to 8.5, end of Narasimha Rao, and then it beautifully built up by Vajpayee, taken over by Manmohan Singh, UPA 2, of course, disaster, and then of course we have had a tapering down because of 2-3 global issues as India became increasingly globalized. We've had the mayhem of 2008 in the US and the Euro sovereign debt crisis, the ripple effect. And in fact, I should also say this, that in economic cycle theory, the 1929-35 depression, Great Depression, started playing itself out in the third quarter of 2007. But 2008, it got to be officially recognized. And in the Internet of Everything age, it's been cushioned at various points in time. So it's kind of got elongated this time, and the effect has not been that severe because there has been cushioning effects. But now we have reached the nadir. Till 2022, the economies will be down world over, and then it will naturally resuscitate. So pretty much the economic narrative of India for 70 years, excuse me, and back to circa 1947. In the immediate aftermath of independence, India had a Pashtun invasion of India, backed by the vile and venal state of Pakistan. Pandit Nehru was able to handle it, but he soon realized that India needs a plan. Which are her defense verticals. He commissioned the services of Professor Blackett, the Nobel Prize winner in physics, to ideate in terms of India's weapons programs. The professor, after a meticulous study, came up with a 5, 10, 15-year plan, period plan, and it was all dovetailed towards capital account and capital acquisition initiatives. And whilst doing so, in my respectful submission, the professor overshot his brief and made a statement that under any circumstance, India ought not to spend more than 2% of her GDP vis-a-vis her defense verticals. Now, this has created a problem which I will discuss as part of the albatross. Suffice to state that barring the wars India had, after the Pashtun invasion, the 65-71 war with Pakistan, the 62 war with China, the Goa Liberation War, the skirmish in Siachen under Rajiv Gandhi, the Kargil War under Atal Bihari Vajpayee, barring these periods, in the immediate aftermath of these periods, of these years rather, India restricted herself to less than 2% of spending vis-a-vis her defense verticals, and whilst doing so, included even the revenue model, which includes the human capital as well, under the 2% note. Now, this created some problems, which I will discuss as part of the albatrosses. And as an indicative archetype, in the 10 years of Manmohan Singh, we hardly spent, the maximum spent was 1.79%. It is no different than the Modi 1.2. But nonetheless, I must say this, that under Pandit Nehru, we had a sub 3% growth rate, and as the growth rate increased in the Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee times, and then of course in Manmohan Singh's time as well, the quantum we spent, even though it was 1.79%, it was out of a larger amount. So for the money actually spent was more. Suffice to state, it was very, very insufficient as well. So when I carefully analyzed all of India's defense expenditure over the 70-year period, with all the issues vis-a-vis her defense economics, I identified 11 albatrosses. For the sake of this narration, I will restrict myself to 4 albatrosses, and if India were to take the corrective measures with respect to the same, we will certainly have robust defense economics in India. The 4 major albatrosses are, the first and second are theoretical. First is GDP, the second is political economics, the United Nations Security Council, the third is the 2% rule, and the fourth is corruption. Now, let me start off with the GDP. Theoretically, the GDP is a creation of Professor Simon Kuznets, who was commissioned by the establishment in the US to analyze the economy and come up with a yardstick which will measure the health of the economy. This was done at a time during the wars in the US, and at a time when the economy was largely characterized by farm produce and manufacturing. Today, in the Internet of Everything age, some economies are 95% service verticals. The GDP is not emblematic of the health of an economy. Now, I have to go back to my college days now and really pay tribute to 2 of my professors. Those days, professors were easily accessible. Knowledge was something they always loved to share. And I remember I started, with a first degree in commerce in Chennai at Vivekananda College, and the principal of the college was a renowned economist, Professor Ganeshan, who, did the distinguished lecture series in money and banking for us. So I was in the 3rd year, and I went and met him, and I said I want to, change to economics as I find it more interesting. I still remember that day, one of those days when outside the college there was some of the government workers digging and stuff like that, contract workers digging and all that, something to do with telephones or whatever. Anyway, so he said, yes, it's a very fascinating field, and in fact there are a number of areas where we can research. My young man, you see, they have dug that road. Let me say something to you. In fact, before saying it, let me say that this morning the security guard told me that a couple of them were sleeping outside the platform and they were drunk, got drunk last night. So the fact of the matter is, they earning wages, is it emblematic of the standard of living in this country? 2, that contractor who got the contract to do that government job would have certainly greased somebody's palm. He will get richer, inequality gets wider. And 3, I told you that these guys were drunk. Who is going to take care of their health costs? And for 25 days, they won't refill the pit. All the students are put to a health hazard. These are ecological issues which have to be handled. Bingo! Shortly thereafter, in 88, 87 fall actually, and 88 spring in the US, renowned professor Gilbert Huebner, who's my professor of advanced macroeconomic thought, had been thrice shortlisted for the Nobel Prize, was chairman of the Philadelphia National Bank, was a member of the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia, had been a member of the Economic Advisory Committee to President Ford, simply told me that the GDP is a wrong indicator because it doesn't bring in climate change. Now, what Professor Ganeshan told me and what Professor Huebner told me is something which was many years ago, is something which the world of economics started grappling with from 2011. Professor Ganeshan told me that even the basic thing like a GDP requires to be researched thoroughly, something reiterated by Professor Huebner, and the truth of the matter is that from 2011, worldwide economists have grappled with this. France, in fact, under Emmanuel Macron, has done away with the GDP and gone in for a wellness index, which includes standard of living, which includes studying inequality, which includes health and climate change factors, and it studies the 6 major macroeconomic markets, brings these factors into account, comes up with a collective number which will be emblematic of the state of the Union vis-a-vis our economic health. So, if we are going to say in India that we are going to have 2% of our GDP on the defense verticals, we are in effect living in a world of fallacy because the GDP itself is a wrong indicator. We need to move towards a wellness index. Second, as part of the GDP, second point, is that an incumbent government, and I'm not making any specific reference at this point in time because this is an apolitical speech, an incumbent government can just move the base here and make its performance to look that much better. The reality would be in contradistinction. So India needs to move away from the GDP, and given the fact that economists at the Ministry of Defense in India have gone by several publications in the American Economic Review, wherein Lagrangian equations have been cranked out with exogenous and endogenous variables about the state of the union, then what India has to do in terms of prognostics, in terms of defense expenditure, when the basis of it was fallacious. All these have been publications. 2 of them have gone on to win the Nobel Prize. Indian economic planners have gone ahead with this and ideated, and that is the reason why we've had several chief of staff sit before parliamentary standing committees and saying we desperately require money for modernization, even our existing equipment is 70% obsolete. Having submitted my point most respectfully, let me go on to the second point, which is in political economy. The United Nations Security Council is an effete organization in terms of India's defense economics, and the reason is very simple. 2 of the permanent members of the Security Council have, since the time of Yaha Khan in Pakistan, consistently funded Pakistan and effectuated transfers of technology. Pakistan has had one objective all through its existence, and that is the destabilization of India. So all their vile efforts at destabilizing India needed India to react. We had to spend that much more on our military verticals. I just started these narratives giving you the $620 billion exemplar. Had India not had the albatross of Pakistan, we would have got to a higher level of welfarism many decades ago. So what is the solution? The solution is simple. Let's first understand how the UN came into being. Before the UN, we had the League of Nations, which by its very definition made the world to be multipolar and therefore to an equitable world order. The problem with the United Nations is the UN Security Council behave like first among equals, and from dominant position they drive hard bargains. One of the solutions is India getting to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. And we have been a very mature nation. We will not do anything which is against dharma, period. Even the curious gallimaufry of people in parties which ruled India between 89 and 91 won't do anything stupid in the foreign policy front. Take it from me. That's the DNA of India's foreign policy. So we need to get there, or to do something even better. In fact, the greatest contribution of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was in the realms of foreign policy. He incubated the non-aligned movement, which by its very definition had regional economies and would have created an egalitarian world order. The problem today in the world in terms of foreign policy, geopolitics or geo-economics is that we have the United Nations Security Council as first among equals. Let me say this to drive home the point. Had 9/11 happened in India, Committee 1540 would not have acted with the same verve, period. The solution is very simple. India needs to get past a $5 trillion economy in real terms, get to a strong level in terms of geopolitics, and that can be done only when it creates geo-economic verve. And India has to either become a permanent member of the Security Council or completely bolster the non-aligned movement, which was the creation of one of India's founding fathers. 3, GDP's 2% of GDP rule. Now, in 1959, there were a group of intellectuals in Delhi who got together and ideated, stating that we need to spend 3% of the GDP. Legends like General Kumaramangalam supported it. Now, I'll come up to the GDP aspect in a minute in terms of solution, but in terms of the 3%, what they meant was 2% for capital account and 1% for revenue account. In circa 2018, India spent about 4 lakh crores on our defense verticals, out of which 1,29,000 crores, or roughly around 30%, went to human capital, the balance to capital account. So this 2/3, 1/3 is something which they advocated. Since I argue against the GDP, let me give you a solution. Once we move to a wellness index, the way forward is very simple. All we require to do is to create 2 committees. One, of course, is the Defence Technology Council, and the other is the Defence Acquisition Council. The Defence Acquisition Council, in keeping with the recommendations of Professor Blackett, ought to ideate 5, 10, 15-year programs about weapons acquisition. And the Defence Acquisition Council will have to go in for the ways and means of raising the money and effectuating the contracts. Now, the way they do, to raise the money is simple. The things they do to raise the money is simple. Excuse me. They'll have to caucus with the Ministry of Finance. And after knowing what India's requirements are in terms of expenditure for the next 15 years, all they have to do is to sensibly play around with our revenues. In 2016, when I did the analysis, I actually did a survey of 4,000 citizens, 2,000 taxpayers and 2,000 non-taxpayers. The 2,000 taxpayers said that if the tax rates are brought below the range of 15 to 18%, there'll be 100% compliance. And the entire 4,000 group were not averse to paying a slab rate of 2,000 rupees a year for effectuating on defense and welfareism in India. So when I did my numbers in 2015, whatever revenue we would have got 4.2 times that revenue. And in terms of, and even if we had spent just 1.5% of that excess revenue in terms of defense, we would have got 2.5 times more in terms of the amount available for expenditure, in which case we would have taken care of both capital and revenue account and still had excess money. And of course, this was only to do with defense, which is 1.5, and the balance could have gone into effectuating welfareism and other measures as well. So the need is to be perspicacious and to understand, to be pragmatic about this. This is the way forward, and this has been followed in Finland, in Sweden, in Argentina, and it can be followed in India as well. Now, finally, the last major albatross is corruption. Right from the 1948 Jeep scandal effectuated and incubated by the Keralite B.K. Krishnamenon to Rafael, no deal has been seen to be above board. Every deal has been seen to be corrupt. My analysis in 2014, I did contact several people in the establishment, outside the establishment, except for 3 or 4 brave generals who had demitted office. The rest didn't want to come on paper. Suffice to state, my submission is this: between 3 to 8% is the kickbacks, 3% in high-end weapon systems, and 11% in revenue model deals, which is like all the Stuttler deals, supply of uniforms and so on and so forth. Now, all we need to do is to incubate an ethical wing as part of the Defence Acquisition Initiative Council. What they do in Finland, do the same thing. 30 citizens of this country are randomly chosen, and on a no-names basis they ideate and they come to a number which is in the highest and best interest of India, and it has a zero-tolerance approach, and the deals can be effectuated en passant. Even the defense companies would love it, because they also spend a lot of money to engage in corruption, and they will also love it. So this is the way going forward, and if we remove these 4 albatrosses, India will have a robust defense economics platform, and there is no better time to do this, because the next genre of theater combat is the military uses of outer space, and right there, right in his constituency, is headquartered a world-renowned organization, the Indian Space Research Organization, which can send n number of military satellites into space. India will get to a dominant position which can enable a lot of peace within India, provide the platform for massive growth of industry, macroeconomic expansion, and in reality will be past the $5 trillion mark in real terms. Thank you so very much. Everything is there in anthology. Please read it. Jai Hind.